You are tuned to Channel 9, Kennett, Zenith Cablevision. Thank you for watching. It's time for talk. Each evening at this time, Monday through Friday, Rosemary interviews local personalities and others who bring items of interest to this community. Time for Talk is a community betterment service designed to cooperate with our local community betterment program. Tonight's program originates in our Time for Talk studios in the Slicer Street Church. And now, it's time for talk.
We have a gentleman in our studio whom I believe could talk on any subject and do a great job, and I have great admiration for that. We have Bob Talbert in the studios, and Bob is a Civil War buff, as among other things, and we've had him on as our guest in times past. And Bob, you've talked with us, given us a lot of history, but I would like, because of the deterioration of some of our tapes in there, we're not able to pull that back off. I want you to talk with us about the impact of the Civil War in this area. Was it great? Was there any, did we have any real battles?
Oh, yeah, of course, the only battle that could be called a battle occurred at Chalk Bluffs up here between Camel and St. Francis, where Highway 62 crosses the river. About 3 or 4 miles north of there is the Chalk Bluff area, and there's a nice park on the Arkansas side you can get to and look at it. Most of the physical evidence of the battle is gone now. You can still find on the Missouri side where the Confederates dug some trenches and put their rear guard out to hold the Union forces off while they got a bridge across the river, made it a way to transport artillerymen and horses. And then on the Arkansas side, they again dug trenches and put the rear guard out after they cleared the river in case the Federals tried to force a crossing on the river, which they didn't. The fight there, it was a pretty brisk fight, but of course by Gettysburg standards it'd be just sort of a minor affair. Wasn't so minor to the guy that got shot. But
all right, now I remember you told me about a hanging that went on. Was this in the same? It had to do with the same period of time? Oh,
yes, that occurred during the Civil War. Of course, Dunklin County was very thinly populated. Its sympathies were divided, and most of the people here were in favor of the Confederacy. But some of the more affluent and so forth, and some of the people that less emotionally moved quickly, did stay with the Union forces because they thought it through, and a lot of them, I think, cold-bloodedly decided that the Union forces would probably win, and they sure didn't want part of a losing cause. Others did it out of conviction and stayed with the Union, which was all right. It was their privilege. But we also had here in this county then these gangs of desperados, really just depraved human thugs, went through the county who really had allegiance to no cause but would claim allegiance to the Confederate cause or to the Union cause to cover their activities, really pillage, robbing, burning, stealing, looting.
Just disguised.
So at any rate, this boy, his name was DeMint, had been sent out to gather up his father's cattle, as I recall the story, and some stock they'd left up there in the brush on the ridge while they'd moved closer to Malden for safety. But not thinking anyone would harm the boy, small boy, they sent him up there, and some of these thugs got a hold of him, bushwhackers really, I guess you'd call them, and in an attempt to find out where the stock was and where his father was, who was hiding from them, and so on, they threw a rope over a tree limb, put it around the child's neck, began to pull him up off the ground, not so playfully, and during the process they hung him, because he couldn't tell them what they wanted to know or refused to tell them. But at any rate, they did hang him. And you can go up the ridge, up the Blacktop Road going due north from Camel, and just ask anybody up there, and they'll tell you where it is, and there's a pretty nice monument to the boy there, and his grave is tended and kept.
All right, now who got the blame? Which side got the blame for doing that?
No one ever put the blame on Confederate or Union that I recall, except they really, when I was a little kid in the old men's club up at Camel, when they'd tell a story, referred to them as bushwhackers.
Okay.
They could have been sort of allied with either side. It wasn't a detachment from either army or anything like that.
Was this the period of the James brothers?
Oh, yeah. The James brothers, of course, rode with Quantrill. William Quantrill, who was probably the scourge of civilization in central Missouri. He's the one that sacked the towns Lawrence, Kansas, and so forth. And he and Bloody Bill Todd, Bloody Bill Anderson, and some of those guerrillas who claimed Southern allegiance, they were horrible people. Oh, horrible. And but Frank and Jesse James, and Cole Younger, sort of learned their trade during the Civil War, riding with Quantrill and other bushwhackers of that time. And when the war ended, well, I think they'd sort of enjoyed it all during the war, and they just kept on. They didn't find it handy to come home. They claimed they tried to turn themselves in, but as far as I've ever been able to be a little older, and those people had a vested interest in slavery. And that was naturally the sympathies up there in that area.
And that's when that's where the battles were a lot more common than down here when they're just
yeah, well, they had
had
a rather brisk fight at Lexington. It was a battle by anybody's standards. And they had several other battles. Most of the thing that occurred in Missouri, though, it being a border state, was a divided loyalties. Mm-hmm. And they would assign a man to command at the federal government would assign a general like Fremont, later Rosecrans, and so forth, to command at St. Louis, and he'd command, say, the Missouri District, which was broken up into several areas. And a general named Thomas Ewing commanded over in the Kansas City area. And the guerrilla action was so bad, running back and forth, and they had no compunction at all about riding through the area and just killing some innocent citizens in order to rob them. Or they'd catch a federal detachment, maybe 10, 15 men out on the road, and they'd ambush them and kill 3 or 4. Mm-hmm. Or they'd catch a picket out by himself. And finally, I guess General Ewing had had his enough, and he couldn't control it any other way, and that's when he issued his infamous Order Number 10 and brought all the people in, required them all to move into a federal encampment where they could keep tabs on them, and they could take nothing except what they carried, very much like the Japanese deal in World War II. And they had to leave their homes, their machinery, just everything they had, and just move in. And at which point the guerrillas from both sides began to swarm all over the area. And even as late as when I was a little old kid, they still referred to a great big area in Vernon County, Clay County, and up in there as the Burnt District. They just burned it to the ground. There wasn't a building left standing or anything. General Ewing, of course, didn't enjoy any popularity in Missouri then or later.
Now, Bob, you were telling me earlier about evidences of some skirmishes of some sort down here,
yeah.
And you gave me a couple of places where...
Well, one I remember when I was just a kid, this would be in the middle 30s, in setting a fence up on the north end of what was then known as the Drew Vardell farm, where the mink farm is now, but up on the north end next to the railroad, in digging post holes and doing some other work, they came across a grave. Had 3 or 4, I don't remember which, skeletons in it. They finally pieced out. And then some old-timers told them that they'd had a minor skirmish there of some nature. The men were either bushwhackers or something, and some army detachment had caught them and killed them, or they ran into some others of their kind and had a fight or something. Mm-hmm. But it was related to the Civil War activity. I never did know just exactly what, but I remember the excitement around here when they dug the bones up. At first they thought it was recent and we had a mass killer loose, you know. And then some old-timers came forward, so I remember when it occurred.
All right. Do I remember that part of Dunklin County seceded from the Union?
Oh, yeah. They had a big meeting at Clarkton just about the time of the Battle of Chalk Bluff, either just before or just after. I think it was just after.
What year are we talking about?
1863. Okay. Clarkton was the larger town in the county then, and if there was any cultural influence, it would have centered around Clarkton. And they had this meeting, and it lasted about 3 days, and they had a lot of speakers talking, you know, and a lot of go around and political hoorah, wherein they passed a petition around and got all those who could sign it to sign it and those that couldn't to exit. And it was moved and seconded and so forth that the county of Dunklin seceded from the state of Missouri because Missouri had not seceded from the Union. And I don't think it represented the total sympathies of the county by a jugful, but it was pretty impressive. And by the way, they never did take us back in either.
Oh, so we're still out.
We're still
so
out,
Dunklin County still, hey, we don't have to pay any of those new taxes that are coming on. Really? So they actually got some sort of legal thing done?
Oh, yeah, and sent the thing up to sent copies of the petition to Jeff City and other places and so on. I think they probably just put them in a wastebasket because no one's ever found them. But it did occur. It is a matter of fact.
All right. So we did not see much battle here because we were so thinly populated. You were telling me a little bit about Frank James, of course, outlived Jesse for a long time and had quite a bit of popularity.
Well, Jesse, of course, was killed in 1882, and Frank lived till 1915, I believe. And their activities during the Civil War led directly to their activities after the Civil War. And it might be of small interest to mention that the first train they held up was right up here about Piedmont, and they learned their trade riding during the Civil War. They went from military or operating under the guise of military activities, they went from there to just direct banditry and made no bones about it.
But they'd probably been doing that same thing all through the war.
Well, they didn't rob trains, but they robbed everything else they could lay hands on, them and that bunch.
All right, Bob, I have heard about some sort of military activity in the Hornersville community. To your knowledge, was there some?
There was some. There wasn't a direct confrontation between organized forces as such. Mostly it was a deal where maybe the captain of the detachment at New Madrid or somewhere, or the major in charge would send a captain and a company down, or more likely a lieutenant and a platoon. And they did that periodically. They'd go through the area just literally sort of showing the flag, let people know they were around. And sometimes they'd come and spend maybe a week in an immediate area, going from place to place and camping and looking for bushwhackers and so forth, checking on known rebel sympathizers and so on. But every now and then those outfits would run into an organized resistance on the part of the irregular forces who claimed allegiance to the Confederacy. And one thing they were really trying to do was to put down this guerrilla activity as such. Leif Bolin operated in this area. His name was infamous for years after the war. He was a bushwhacker, claimed Confederate allegiance, but as far as I know was never enlisted in the regular troops. And he operated here, and he was known to be a vicious individual.
So you're saying that a lot of the feelings and sympathies that people had, say, against the Yankees, was really due to bushwhackers, was really due to rank outlaws who had no allegiance to North or South.
Well, people that lived in a place, say like 4 Mile, Camel wasn't there then, lived in at 4 Mile, it was a town. Clarkton was a town. Kennett was a town of sorts. Those people living within those towns probably could feel fairly secure. But if you lived out in the country, you went to bed scared every night. You never knew who was going to be kicking on the front gate, what kind of people might show up. It was dangerous.
And under the guise of I am a Northern sympathizer or a Southern, I'm a generations.
Oh, Lord have mercy, yes. When I was a small kid around here, there were several families that some felt hard toward one another. There were ill feelings even between families that dated clear back to the Civil War era. Some of them would say, well, you know, my granddaddy down there, when they raided his place and they burned the barn, they burned the house and set him and his wife and kids out there on a cold night afoot, old so-and-so down the road, they didn't bother him. He wouldn't even come up there and help them. I've heard that story. Of course, old so-and-so probably didn't dare to make much effort. He'd be next.
Yeah, yes. I would see where old so-and-so would be afraid to stick his head out. You have been listening to Bob Talbert. He has talked about the Civil War, and I have listened. It's a fascinating glimpse into history. And, Bob, thank you for coming out and being our guest.
Yes, ma'am. I enjoyed it.
You have been watching Time for Talk. Time for Talk is a community betterment service designed